Well, thanks everybody for coming. This is our second to last YW Talks of the season. So we have one more coming up next month, and that will be Suzette DeSalle, who's going to be talking about women's suffrage in Montana. But for today, this is Amber Gladney. She was a Peace Corps volunteer in Mali, West Africa, from 2008 to 2011, working as a health extension agent in a rural clinic. She did gender empowerment related work, designing and implementing local girls' camps, building Peace Corps gender development resources and infrastructure, and as a secondary project. She also worked for a NGO called Project Muso Ladamunen. There you go. And the project for the empowered woman in her final year of service, supporting 27 community health workers who provided in-home diagnostic malaria testing and treatment along with prenatal support. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome. And thanks again, Amber, for coming.
And I'm hoping that this will actually show some images. So we'll see if I'm not sure if the timer's working on that. I had this set up before and it would. So we'll just.
Do you have a clicker?
I do not.
No. Okay, so it might.
We can just go ahead and. All right, I'll just talk from here then. So hello and welcome. Simula, Auniche, Alakatila Hirachaya. My name is Amber Gladney, but in Bambara, the language of my greeting, my name is Fatoumata Traore, so you can call me whichever you prefer, or Fatim for short, which is generally what I went by. As Miranda mentioned, I served in the Peace Corps in Mali, West Africa, as a health extension agent from 2008 to 2011. And I would just like to thank you so much for the opportunity today to share my experiences and to talk about my greatest passion. It is so wonderful to be in the presence of esteemed colleagues who are just so passionate about the same issues as myself, women's suffrage, women's full capacity to participate in their society. I think that there's a lot of relevance in looking not only at our system now, but the way that those can work themselves out internationally. So to give you an idea of my service, or of myself before we get started, in particular, I'd like to note that I am a Montanan by heart. My family is originally from Glasgow, Montana. We homesteaded there in the early part of the century. I come from Riverside, California initially, where I was born, and my family decided to move back up when I was 10. Now that I'm finished with the Peace Corps, I have returned to Missoula, and this is definitely the place where my heart is located, so I hope to continue working in Montana throughout my career. I am also very passionate about gendered rights and about the pursuit of gender equity. This began for me when I studied political science and women's studies at Gonzaga University. I was able to take some of the ideas that were already in my head and really get that theoretical context to fully understand concepts such as what is feminism, what is gender versus sex, what does empowerment look like when it's from an international perspective. And as a result of that interest, I pursued two notable experiences that really shaped who I am. The first was that I worked with Take Back the Night at the Gonzaga University in that community. And so I worked particularly with students. However, I was really taken by the ability to mobilize voices and to work together as a community to target different issues that were directly affecting that community. And likewise, I worked at the Spokane Regional Health District Outreach Center, providing outreach in particular to sex workers. And I found this experience to be very humbling. I found that it really opened my eyes up to the concepts of harm reduction, to the concepts of human rights as manifested in very vulnerable populations. And now that I have gone through the formative experience of serving with the United States Peace Corps, I've realized that my passion is really bringing that fight back home. And so I'm currently pursuing my master's in social work at the University of Montana. I am working as the United States Peace Corps recruiter for the University of Montana. And I am also working as an intern for the Poverello Center. And so I sort of have this diverse experience right now that I'm bringing to the table. I'm very committed to challenging oppression and social injustice in particular. And I'm very interested in the intersection between gender inequity and economic inequity. And I think that my experiences in Mali really gave me a well-rounded perspective to take that lens and come back and focus on my own community. And I'd just like to note that I have really immense respect for the work that y'all are doing here at the YWCA. And so thank you for what you do. Can I start off by asking, first of all, are there any returned Peace Corps volunteers in the room? Wonderful. Well, thank you ladies so much for joining us today. Can I ask where you served?
Ghana.
Ghana.
I recognize it.
I was going to say. And what about yourself? Saipan. So you can see we have, great representation already in the community. Do we have any folks who have friends or family that served as Peace Corps volunteers? Excellent. And what about folks who are thinking about joining the Peace Corps? All right, so we've got really the whole gamut. So I hope to teach you something new about the Peace Corps today. Peace Corps is definitely a very diverse experience. Every volunteer for the last 50 years has had a different experience in their villages, but there are a lot of commonalities. And so I'd like to really preface this presentation with, this is my experience. It's something that brought me immense joy, and because of that I'd like to share it with you. It's not necessarily a reflection of everyone's, but I think that it's a great example of the potential that volunteers can harness in their service. So, Peace Corps, to give you a little background, has been an important part of America's history for more than 50 years. Volunteers have historically served in more than 139 countries around the globe. Currently, there are over 215,000 current and returned Peace Corps volunteers. And what most people don't know is that Peace Corps actually has 3 goals. So we're not just a development-oriented organization. The Peace Corps' mission is to promote world peace and friendship by fulfilling 3 goals. The first is to help people in interested countries to meet their needs for trained men and women. The second is to help promote a better understanding of Americans on the part of the people served. And the third is to help promote a better understanding of other people on the part of Americans. Peace Corps is a 27-month commitment to serve in one of over 60 countries worldwide currently. Volunteers work in diverse sectors from health to education, environment, agriculture, business, and youth and development. And though every volunteer has a primary assignment, volunteers also have room for secondary projects. And a secondary project that I'm going to talk about in particular today is that of GAD, Gender and Development. So GAD is gaining serious traction in the Peace Corps community, and in many places volunteers, often third years, or people who have extended, work formally and exclusively with gender and development-oriented programming. So today I'll speak about a number of experiences that I had in my primary role, but I'll also highlight the way that I utilize this opportunity for a secondary project to pursue gender empowerment in my community and throughout Mali. So some examples of major successes in gender and development programming that are happening around the world right now include Camp GLOW, Girls Leading Our World. This is a week-long camp generally for girls that are in secondary education positions, and girls are going to focus on everything from life skills, decision-making, to planning their future, to looking at different aspects of reproductive health care, and it can really be tailored to the needs of the community and to the needs of the ages of those girls in particular. Likewise, there are many sports clubs that have been funded that allow girls to harness their community energy, work together to build friendship, and to also have side projects that maybe involve, once again, that concept of life skills, decision making. And finally, there's a really strong movement right now for boys clubs and for men's clubs to really help the global communities that we're serving understand the dynamic of gender as being an entire spectrum, and of communities needing to take responsibility from many positions. So I just think that those are some really incredible and noteworthy opportunities. So to give you an idea before I get into my whole experience, what I was hoping and what I was planning is that I would talk about 3 different aspects of my service, and we could take time in between each to answer any questions. And if we don't have any questions, then we can go ahead and hold those on to the end. But I see my service is divided into 3 separate occurrences. One is my primary assignment as a health extension agent in a small village. The second is my gender and development-oriented programming that is both countrywide and specific to my community. And finally, I'll be speaking about my work in a non-governmental organization. So I'll start out by giving you a little context about my country. We'll talk about health, and then I'll pause. Gender and development, I'll pause and whatnot. Does that sound all right to everyone? Perfect. So I myself served as a health extension agent in the sub-Saharan West African country of Mali, West Africa. Mali is a country with an incredibly rich culture and a very rich history. Historically, Mali has been a part of 3 different West African empires spanning thousands of years. Those include the Ghanaian Empire, the Malian Empire, for which Mali is currently named, and the Songhai Empire. And you may have heard of a little town called Timbuktu. Timbuktu is actually located in the northern portion of Mali, and it has been an important part of Mali's history since the time of the European Renaissance. I like to highlight that Timbuktu is directly related to the book trade and to strong traditions of scholarship that can be traced to modern education. In particular, in the 16th century, under the reign of Askia al-Hajj Muhammad, there was a golden era, a political and intellectual movement. So where people were really pursuing scholarship and were trying to develop different means of education that could be spread to just more than the elite class. Likewise, in around 1548, Askia Daud began the mass establishment of libraries around Timbuktu in the region. So once again, that connection to scholarship is incredibly strong in the region of Mali. Mali was introduced to Islam around the time of the European Renaissance, and although Mali is often identified as a Muslim country, to which there's polygamy in the country, there's definitely a strong tradition of prayer at mosque. However, I would counter that much like America is assumed to be a Christian country or is often identified as a Christian country and has many nuances, including different connections to paganism, Mali in particular has a strong connection to animism. So those are spirits of the earth, spirits that are related to their agricultural cycle, and although there is this tendency to outwardly identify with Islam, I'd say that many people have a very nuanced faith that is connected to the earth and that is connected to one another, and that the strongest manifestation that I saw of Islam was their belief, for those folks who don't know, much like the 10 Commandments, Islam has 5 pillars, one of which is almsgiving. I found that Malians very strongly adhere to this concept of almsgiving and communal responsibility for one another. So there was definitely a sense of that integral interconnectedness, mandated not only by God, but adhered within the community. In the 1800s, Mali actually became a French country. There are many remnants of former colonial France in Mali right now. Those include the leftover educational systems, the leftover health infrastructure. Likewise, Mali's national language is French, although the vast majority of the population speaks a local language. In 1960, Mali did gain their independence from France and became a democracy. And until very recently, which we can touch on a little later, Mali has been considered one of the most stable democracies in the region of West Africa. So that's another context that's important to understand. When I served, Mali was rated as one of the 5 poorest countries of the world. So you can only imagine when I got my assignment, I had never heard of the country, and I started looking up demographics, and I found out not only was this fact true, but also Mali was rated extremely high on the Gender Inequality Index. And I found out that there was a prevalence, for example, of female genital mutilation to the tune of perhaps 99% of the population. There was also very widespread low literacy rates, despite the strong tradition of scholarship. However, what I saw in my day-to-day interactions and living in that community and in going particularly through my pre-service training was that people seemed incredibly happy. And there was this very ingrained sense of community. It was a dichotomy that I didn't quite know how to digest initially. Today, Mali is home to some of the greatest artists, musically and artisanally, of our time. Likewise, like I mentioned before, many of Mali's social values are based on community and interconnectedness. And before I saw any of these aspects of poverty or inequity, like I said, I was very much struck with a connection that people insisted on having one another, a lack of sensing strangers, a lack of identifying one another's or other people as strangers. Thank you so much. And so, in this context, I was assigned to serve as a health extension agent in Mali, West Africa, or in Monsambala, which is a small farming village of approximately 500 people that was located 10 miles off of the main road, so an hour bicycle ride in, and served a radius of approximately 10 kilometers. In general, health volunteers work with local governments, clinics, non-governmental organizations, and communities at the grassroots level, where the need is the most urgent and the impact can be met, or the impact can be the greatest. So my experience working with the clinic was very unique in that I was not only partnered with the doctors, but also with many women's associations throughout the community. And so I'd like to take a moment to touch on that aspect of the people that I was connected to, because I feel that without my community integration and without my experience of being a family member and a friend, my work would not be effective. So first of all, I was assigned a homestay family, a host family, when I went to my village. That meant that although I did not live directly with them, I lived right next door to them, that they were in charge of making sure that my needs were met. So if there was any concern that I couldn't negotiate myself, if there was something that I was uncertain about or things that I needed to understand in the village, they would be my point people. And likewise, they were the people who were really charged with making sure that I had a strong social experience. And that's a two-way street. So one thing that I found very unique, within this village of 500 people, it was a polygamous society, and it was a community that was it was all in the family. So in that sense, my community had close to 100 different houses with 500 people total. So some houses had up to 30 people living in the area. Other folks had maybe just 2 or 3. In particular, my host father and mother were the elders of my family. So Bu and Ba were my homestay mothers and fathers. They were both approximately 70 years old. And what I found to be an immediate connection is that at their age, they were not obligated to follow any social expectations. In Mali, the older you get, the more elder you are considered, the more wise you're considered, and the more leniency you're given with your personality. So I instantly bonded in that they were very sarcastic, very witty. I taught them the phrase, "you call it like it is," and that was very much the perspective that I took away from that. And so in recognizing these little aspects of commonality between my personality and their personality, I realized that this was a relationship that I could nourish. So I became very close to Bu and Ba. Along with Bu and Ba, they had 2 sets of children who then had many children amongst themselves. We also had a brother of the family, his wife, and their children. So in total, it was approximately 30 people living in one concession, so in one yard, I guess you would say, with multiple houses, and I was right next door to them. These were my go-to people. These were the people that I woke up with and had porridge with in the morning. These were the folks who, when I was really sick and didn't want to hang out with anybody or just wanted to be by myself, would break down my door, sit in front of me, and demand that I eat porridge until I feel better. These were also the people who would take me to market. In my first few months, I realized I had to go a whole hour's bike ride away just to get things like basic produce. So they literally held my hand and took me to market and explained not only what would be a good price, but also who would be the worthwhile vendors. I like to tell the story that in my first few weeks in village, I was very concerned with my housing, and that I hadn't lived by myself before. I'd always had roommates, or I always had a family member, and this was the very first time that I had my own domicile, even if it was just 2 rooms. And within the first night, I heard something banging on my door at about 3 in the morning. There was a lot of wind, there was a lot of weather, I was still familiarizing myself with the area, so I blew it off. The next night, about 3 a.m., I heard this banging at my door again. The third night, I decided that I was going to do something about it. I went to my family and said, "I think someone's trying to break into my house. I'm really concerned. This person is incessantly knocking at my door." They immediately went to the chief of the village and said, "Someone's trying to get into Fatim's house." The chief immediately had a town crier go around the village and tell them, "If anybody tries to mess with Fatim, you're going to have to leave the village." So that night at 3 a.m., I heard the banging again. I got brave enough and realized that it was a cat reaching underneath my door and pulling the aluminum so that it slammed back and forth. But I like to use this as an anecdote in that even with something, they didn't even go through the steps of saying, are you sure? Did you consider all the different options, or do we need to talk to someone? It was this immediate verdict that you are a priority, our connection with you is extremely valued, and we will not tolerate anything that will threaten your well-being. And so there was definitely a real sense of responsibility that was taken by my family for me. As, let's see, because I was partnered with this clinic, I had some very basic responsibilities like assisting with prenatal consultations and infant growth monitoring, but I wanted to get a sense of the community's greater need. So one thing that's unique about my service is that I actually spent the first 3 months doing an intensive community assessment where, in partnership with the doctors at the clinic where I was partnered, I went to every single household in my community, so all 100 of those different domiciles, and I greeted, introduced myself, and went through a series of questionnaires about what their greatest health concerns were. As you can imagine, speaking a local language, being new to the culture, there were a lot of nuances, like was I asking a question that was going to get a real answer? Or was I asking something that people would just blow off immediately? And so I used this partnership with my directors of the clinic and with the co-doctors I'd have them accompany me and I'd have them give me a perspective about whether my questions were good or not. And by the very end of my assessment, I had literally introduced myself to everyone in the village. I'd explain my roles and responsibilities. I'd explain my position as a possible advocate and someone who could create change that was inspired by their needs. And they identified a series of needs that had not been prioritized by the clinic, including increased awareness of nutritional possibilities, so what they could use of their local resources to improve the nutrition both of young mothers and also of children. But they also identified the need for a greater understanding of reproductive health care. So I'd like to stop and highlight that in Mali, every clinic is required to provide only 5 basic services. So those include curative consultations, prenatal consultations, infant growth monitoring, vaccination, and birth. So you can imagine that the predominant users of our clinical services are mothers and young children. Despite this connection, however, and because I would refute the prevalence of traditional medicine in the community where I worked and a distrust of Western medicine in general, we were definitely working with a very particular population. We were working with women who had that buy-in, that trust of this Western medical system. And so in going throughout the community, really trying to explain myself, become rooted and integrated, and then asking questions that were targeted towards their needs, I was able to get a more nuanced perspective than what they could just get from their clinical intake papers. So that really shaped my perspective as a health education volunteer. At the clinic, we had just a few doctors, and of course these are all photos taken in and outside of the clinic. We had a midwife, a director, and only one curative doctor. And the nature of the consultations were that each day of the week corresponded to various services. So on these days, women from the surrounding areas sought services en masse, meaning that one doctor might serve 50 patients from 8 a.m. until 8 p.m. in the afternoon. And with the vast majority of our patients being mothers, we also had a lot of children that accompanied. So we realized that one very strong barrier for service utilization was that oftentimes these women were traveling from maybe 10 kilometers away. They were not able to feed their children. They had to perhaps wait 6 or 7 hours. They were not able to maintain communication with their family. And so we looked at that comparison of this need for nutritional education and this lack of support for women who were actually pursuing consultations. And we decided that we would move forward with a porridge demonstration that would occur during 2 of our major incentivized service days. So during days when we had prenatal consultations, Mondays, and during days when we held mass infant growth monitoring, Wednesdays, we would have porridge demonstrations 3 times a day. So that meant, and I'll preface with, porridge is the main meal of children once they're weaned from breastfeeding. So it is absolutely the sole source of nutrition for children, often 6 months to 2 years. And although we do a lot of work with encouraging women to breastfeed through 2 years in Mali because of different concerns about water and whatnot, we did have a number of women who either were pregnant or were in a situation where they were not able to actually breastfeed their children. So we had to talk to them about what they could do to increase the weight of their babies, to increase their capacity for growth in particular. Many children were born with low birth weights and continue to have incredibly low growth in their percentiles. And so we decided that we would identify different women in the community who were particularly interested in learning about nutritional education. We would go through a series of seminars and trainings to educate them about nutritional options that were viable in the community. For example, we had moringa trees and mango trees and a number of trees that had very high vitamin A and iron available through their fruits and their leaves. So we discussed the capacity for using these local resources in their foods in a way that wasn't necessarily considered before to make those foods more nutritionally viable for the children. So out of this training, we would have these women facilitate different conversation groups throughout the day for these women so that not only were participants being given the capacity to come and stay, to come to their consultations without worry of how to feed themselves or their children, but they were also learning the basic skills that would enable them to increase the growth of their children. So for folks who were just going in for infant growth monitoring, maybe their children would get vaccinations, we'd give them a basic consultation and describe the ways that they could improve their nutritional capacity, but they weren't being given those hands-on skills. And oftentimes having a woman, a mother with many children who was able to speak from her personal context and her personal expertise to these other women about the ways that they could change their behavior, we found it to be incredibly effective, and we started seeing a spike in our numbers. So we started seeing an even greater utilization and an even greater interest in the community. Along with assisting with this process of providing trainings and different education for facilitators, I also provided direct service to women. So although I did not do anything that would require the breaking of skin or the blood barrier, I was able to do things like measuring children's height and weight, which you just saw photos of. I was able to do things like assist with record keeping, and also to help out with consultations. And so in that way, I had the additional opportunity to really familiarize myself with the community in which I worked, and also, once again, to introduce myself and to make myself well known in my intentions and in my role. I can't emphasize enough how important this is. Even in a culture where strangers are still considered to be friends and people who are capable of making change are two different things. And so I really had to work to establish myself as a legitimate actor who was directly concerned with their needs and who wasn't approaching the situation from a top-down perspective. Let's see. I also worked with one person in particular who was incredibly inspiring, and ironically, his name was Alu Jara. He was a young man, and he was about 25 years old. He was our curative doctor, so he was the doctor who worked directly with patients. I was incredibly impressed by Alu's extreme dedication to his job and by his extremely strong feminist values, despite existing in this culture that was very misogynistic and patriarchal in many ways. Alu was a breath of fresh air, and that in the context of health workers who were overworked, exhausted, placed outside of their homes in places of greater needs, placed outside of their communities to serve communities in need, Alu had taken that charge with full seriousness. And he committed his work. He would come to the clinic at 7 a.m. and sometimes when I'd be there or when I'd walk by at midnight, he would still be servicing different women visiting the clinic. And so I worked directly in partnership with him. After a while, I realized that he was the real mover and shaker in our clinical community. He was the one who was giving those very motivational interviewing speeches to his consultants or to the people he was giving consultations to. He was the one who would, on his off days, take his motorcycle and go to the most remote villages where he would perform vaccinations and prenatal consultations. And he was the one who, when we had different larger infrastructure health workers who came in and said, we have to cut the budget X, Y, or Z way. He was always looking for new innovative solutions to serve his community. And so, once again, I think that my relationship with Alu and my ability to really see his compassion and his dedication affected my perspective of change and affected the way I saw the capacity of one person in cahoots with a whole community to create great change. So at this point, I'd like to pause and see if anyone has any questions about my experience working with a clinic.
When you started when you started the formula teaching, not formula, but porridge teaching, did someone provide resource funding for that? And was it separate from, it wasn't Peace Corps, so was it a grant somewhere else or through the hospital?
That's a great question. We actually had a little bit of money set aside at the clinic for starter funds. So we were able to use both resources that were available in the community. So women would contribute extra peanut butter or moringa leaves or lime juice. And then the community would provide this, or the clinic would provide this mass of the grains and the clean water with which to mix the porridge. And in time, we ended up working with the women to identify whether or not that was sustainable. And they decided that within the facilitator community, they would really try to mobilize people to bring as many resources as possible. So I did find it to be sustainable, and that initially there was this big startup cost where we were often providing the supplies for the porridge, but in time the women were incredibly invested and took great pride in their position as leaders. So they were able to really work with other associations and with other folks to contribute little bits here and there.
Were they paid at all by the hospital for that work?
They were not. And that was something that was spoken directly about in our trainings, and I think it really goes back to that sense of almsgiving and of community. Even in this context, these villagers who were in many ways very much struggling to even meet their basic nutritional needs, it was a great honor for them to be able to contribute and to show their dedication to that change, which was really incredible to witness.
Did you ever encounter having to work at all, like with victims of HIV or AIDS and things like that in that community?
So Mali actually has a relatively low rate of HIV/AIDS. It's actually lower, or it was when I was serving, than the rates in the United States. In my community, however, we did have a very big issue with syphilis. There was a large prevalence of syphilis, and the greatest issue there was that it was a polygamous society. So often we would treat one wife for symptoms, and we would give her full antibiotics. She'd complete her rounds, and then she would be exposed by the husband again. Or even if we treated all the wives and the husband, there were more fluid sexual dynamics, and that there were outsiders that came into the community, and oftentimes when we had outsiders who would stay for a few weeks, we'd see a spike in syphilis rates once again.
And how did you kind of go about, I mean, this is probably a larger discussion, but communicating just what you were doing as far as, treating them in terms that they could really understand, since, I mean, it seems like these people were obviously more open to the Western way of, medicine and things, but like, I also know that they probably needed a little bit more of a different explanation.
Absolutely. I mean, and if we can take a dosage of medication as an example. How do you say you have to take this on the hour 4 times a day when you don't own a clock? Okay. Or how are you going to remember to take your birth control at every time, every day?
Or when you just like their perspective on taking medicine in general, and like what that looked like?
So I would say I definitely followed the lead of my main doctor. I was never the one to initiate conversations. Later on in my service, when I had served in that capacity for about half a year, that's when Alu really let me start working with the women independently. But I took a great portion of my time really observing the ways that Alu interacted with the women. And what I found to be incredible was that he would always figure out where they were at first. So it never started off with a directive. It was always a conversation, and that would be the case with any consultation. It was never straight to business. It was, how are you? What's your name? Where's your family from? Do you have your baby with you today? How's he doing? Have you been on any trips lately? I think that I know someone in that village. Do you know X, Y, or Z? So there was a lot of really getting to know the person first. And then Alu would assess, so is this your first time going to a doctor? How comfortable do you feel here? Do you have any questions? And from there, he would lead and get a sense of whether this was something that they were familiar with, whether their parents were big advocates for Western medicine, so they had received multiple consultations in their life, or if it was the first time, Alu would really backtrack to explaining the context of Western medicine, discussing where traditional medicine and Western medicine can meet. And I must say that can't be emphasized enough, that we definitely worked in correspondence with the traditional healers. We did not try to work separately. There were many traditional healers who had incredibly effective means of medicating the community. And so we tried to work with those healers in particular and say there are certain things that you are exceptional at. There are other things that, for example, like malaria treatment. If you do reach a certain fever at a certain age, that can result in permanent brain damage. So when you see this symptom, please refer them to us immediately. And we found that it was a very strong relationship between our Western medicine and our traditional healers. And so we would have those conversations about, have you used the traditional healer? What were your experiences? So if you understand that concept of medicine, of taking something to be better, let's talk about what that looks like in the context of Western medicine. And particularly when it came to more heady concepts like, this is a prenatal consultation that requires you come back in exactly 3 months' time. Let's go ahead and set up an appointment, or let's make sure that you're available on this date. Or we're going to put you on a complex series of medications, including a fever reducer, an antibiotic, and an antihistamine, and you have to take them in this order. So he would really break down all of those components, and it was repetition, repetition, repetition. Really simplifying those concepts, often using, for folks who maybe haven't even gotten past the 3rd grade, there are a lot of basic pieces that they would have to explain about, making sure that that numerical count was off. In a different context and working with a non-governmental organization, we discovered a real inadequacy of just that basic mathematics. So talking about, how do you make sure that you are completing your dosage of antibiotics in a proportional way? So it was really speaking from their understanding, getting a sense of their understanding first, and then working to give them capacity from there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great.
Wonderful.
A comment that's really interesting is, because I was in very northern Ghana, so very close to Mali, and looking at seeing what you're saying and looking at the pictures, and then I've gone back and worked 3 times in Africa, it is exactly the same as 24 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it's so slow.
Yes.
And what I liked hearing is how invested your fellow physician was, because that has really, I've heard through a lot of Peace Corps volunteers, progressed where Malayans or Ghanaians or themselves are starting to see themselves as people that can make change in a community, whereas it used to be this would be a doc that got assigned from the major cities and got sent there and was pissed about being there and taking, bribe under the table to get better care and stuff. So it's lovely to see that, and yet the type of care is, the pictures and everything is exactly 24 years ago still. So
absolutely,
yeah.
It's so interesting.
So why are the HIV rates lower?
So my sense is that there just hasn't been exposure in the sense that we have very few large urban areas, and I'd say the higher concentrations would be there, but in the rural areas it hasn't spread yet. So there's a lot of work being done in greater rural or in greater urban areas to talk about prevention. Because
it's not on a big transport road either, so it's the transport cities sometimes that end up as the spread base point in the.
Absolutely.
We'll go ahead and, I'll go ahead and take a step back and talk about my gender and development work in coordination with this experience. So when I was working with this, in this clinical setting, in this village setting, very decentralized, I realized that there were so many strong women leaders. And I was once again hit with this juxtaposition of gender inequity in the face of so much power and so much potential. I saw women who were willing to challenge the status quo, who were willing to say, I'm interested in having 5 children instead of 8. Or I don't care if I have to be seen as different or subversive. I'm going to put peanut butter in my children's porridge, which may sound simple, but in a culture that does not value difference, those steps can be incredibly powerful and meaningful. So in looking at that dynamic of these strong women and yet this powerlessness in many contexts, I thought to myself, boy, there's really a lot of potential here. I wonder what I could do with gender and development-oriented work. And I thought back to Take Back the Night, and I thought back to working with sex workers, and I thought back to all of those opportunities where we took small moments of courage and really built on them to create something much bigger than just those individual actors. So I started doing a little research when I was around the Capitol, and I found out that Mali was not in the countries that had gender and development programming, and yet many countries that were surrounding us did. And these, like I said, they could look like different camps, sports clubs, International Women's Day celebrations, but there was nothing happening in Peace Corps Mali in that regard. So I started talking to women in my own community about their interest. I said, you know, if we did something that was just working with the girls or something that was just working with the women, do you think that that might be all right? And at this point, they really knew who I was. They knew what my passions were. And they said, you know, Fatim, if you're interested, let's try it. So then I started working with Peace Corps staff. In particular, I was working with women who served the position of language and cultural facilitators. They were people who did the training for the Peace Corps, who themselves straddled this world of working with the American Embassy and also working within their own context as teachers. And I said, you know, do you think that this is something that would be feasible that you could teach volunteers about these different types of work? You're teaching them how to work in the health sector. Could we develop some sort of training for incoming volunteers about how to work with women? And they said, that sounds like an incredible idea. And so then I reached out to those other countries that had these different programs. I started talking not only to volunteers, but to different country directors for the Peace Corps. I started looking online for different resources that were available. I started looking in particular at Girls Leading Our World, this camp. I thought, what a potent idea in a culture where almost every child, once they reach 5th or 6th grade, drops out. Wouldn't it be great to harness that potential at that age and really get them thinking about that next step that could be greater than just staying in village? And so I established a volunteer committee in which we decided that we would assess and organize necessary resources to create a gender and development supportive programming through the Peace Corps. And we piloted a handbook and a community assessment tool for volunteers to use in their community. So for every Peace Corps volunteer who was interested to go and say, okay, I've got this assessment, let's start talking to women, let's start talking to leaders, let's see what their interests are, let's see what's already existent, what we can build on, and what we can do that's new. We found out from this assessment the results were just incredible. We had so much interest. People said, you know, we have different women's associations, we have women working in leadership, but they're so hardworking that often we don't get to tap into that, or, you know, we'd like to see how we can do that ourselves. And so we decided that our pilot program would be Take Our Daughters to Work week-long events. So these were camps that recruited girls in the 5th and 6th grade who completed writing contests to talk about what they wanted to be when they grew up. We took girls from the rural area, brought them to the closest regional capital, where they did a week of visiting schools, visiting different women working in vocations. So we had folks who spent a day with female police officers, spent a day with women working in the entrepreneurial setting, so in restaurants or in small businesses, with women who were working for the military, and had them just not, we had some formalized structure, you know, you need to go through X, Y, and Z, see them in their job, but then there was a lot of time for these women just to be in the company of these girls, which was very much a Malian cultural norm. You treat every stranger as your family, and, you know, you really take that time to get to know them. And so we wanted to really build on that relationship component. And we piloted that in my region. I actually had the opportunity to include my village in one of the Take Our Daughters to Work week-long camps, and it was incredible. There is a photo which I'm just going to go ahead and backtrack. Kim, you've seen this before.
It's my favorite picture.
And this really says it all. This is one of our participants who had just learned about menstruation for the very first time. Many of the women and the elders who associated or who came along, they also had just learned about menstruation. So this is her face of sheer joy as she showed us her illustration of fallopian tubes and of eggs moving through the system. And so there was just a lot of opportunity. Every community could really tailor these camps to their girls' needs, to their interests. And this reproductive healthcare class in which this girl is celebrating, that was a very unique experience in that we had invited a different speaker from the community to come in and talk to girls about what they could do to really change their world. And she came in, she closed the door, she closed the blinds, she got to the front, and she said, that's not what we're going to talk about today. Today we're going to talk about how your bodies work. We're going to tell you about pregnancy. We're going to talk to you about menstruation. We're going to talk to you about menopause, because remember, there were many elders in the room that had never gotten this education themselves. And she spent an hour going through these different components, and the lights and these young girls and these women's eyes was just so inspiring. It really just fed my interest to keep going, keep working through it, keep inspiring other volunteers to work with gender programming. And so, let's see if that just shut that down. So we've only got 10 minutes, and I would like to leave some time to talk about this opportunity or this experience working with camps. And if we have time, you know, I can highlight a little bit of my non-governmental organization work. But in general, I'd say that, you know, those two components of my service were very representative of the potential for community integration, the community identification and needs process, and really helping people to identify as leaders and helping women in particular to see themselves as change makers. And so whether it was working with elder women, working with young girls, working with doctors, working with patients, I had many opportunities to be in that intersection of knowledge seeking and empowerment. And I just found it to be very, very powerful. So does anyone have any questions about my work with organizing girls' camps?
How much did you involve the men in the community for?
So the men were involved with a lot of the initial decision making, which was very interesting because we utilized a traditional system of accessing the elders and the leaders first, running ideas by them. So the chief and his cohorts, so 3 of the most elder men in our village, were very interested in this idea. So they were the ones who approached the director of the school and the different teachers. They were the ones who approached different female leaders and elders in the community to talk about who would accompany young girls. And they were the ones that really championed the cause to their greater community. So often we found the support of the men, which was surprisingly high, was really that point of impetus. And from there were men who were involved in the planning process and the actual coordination process. So when we were doing things like housing girls for a week, providing transportation, providing meals, oftentimes there were men who played support roles, but oftentimes it was a very female space. And I think that that's something that we're really trying to nurture, especially because in the context of education, oftentimes girls were the ones who didn't speak up or who were overshadowed by their male counterparts in the classroom. And so we really wanted this to be a safe space where women could really celebrate the power both within themselves and the power in their connection.
Isn't it interesting that you can do that in a country that is, the majority is polygamous, and separate that out so that empowering women doesn't mean necessarily saying your cultural belief in polygamy is wrong. As most of my friends in Ghana that were in multiple marriages said, I don't want to be his only wife. You know, like they much enjoyed that culture too.
Absolutely.
It wasn't there. They didn't feel less empowered because they were wife number 3 in it. But it's interesting. It's hard to do that. I'm sure you at times wanted to go.
Absolutely. And I think what very much helped was in that involvement of the elders who weren't held to the same standards, who could be much more outspoken. We were very intentional about reaching out to that demographic who was dually very supported in the community and was able to be a little bit radical. And like I said, it was really surprising to go in with the expectation that we'd meet a lot of resistance and to time and time again be met with this very celebratory position of, yes, we want more for our girls and we don't know how to do it. You know, if you're willing to help us, we are definitely on board. So that's a great question. And polygamy in particular, one thing that I found very interesting was the argument that I have a built-in sisterhood. And not only that, but I can rely on my sisters in this country of extreme hardship. Maybe between us, you know, we have 14 children. I can't do this by myself. But if I have my sister who can help me with the cooking, and I have my sister who can help me with the cleaning, I can, you know, be much more effective. So like you said, really taking it from that cultural relevant standpoint, and I like to use the term cultural humility. It's one that I just recently learned from a professor in one of my University of Montana social work classes, but with the concept being you can't not only say I'll be respectful, you also have to say I come from a place of not knowing, and I want to better understand, and I want to serve you in a way that meets your needs and that really respects your culture.
Has Peace Corps hooked any of those camps with like programs like GUTS here?
So not that I know of, but I think that that would be an incredible partnership. We do have a program called Worldwide Schools that allows volunteers who are in the fields to partner up with classrooms in the United States. And I have heard of those, if it's an education volunteer or someone who works with youth groups, of that becoming an exchange directly between students. So I wonder if, there couldn't be some great potential there.
Not that way, honey, this way.
Well, I can just quickly, in our last 5 minutes or so, I can highlight my work with Project Muso Ladamunen, the Project for the Empowered Woman. So in my, about a year into my service, I realized that there was no way I was going to be ready to leave in an additional year. So not everyone knows, but in Peace Corps you can actually extend. And although it may seem a little crazy to decide you're going to spend another third year in a very hot foreign country, it was something that I was just really passionate about. And I realized that I wanted a new opportunity, that I wanted to really expand my skill set. I had enjoyed the challenge of gender and development work very much. And in looking towards other organizations that were doing things like this on a bigger picture, I heard about Project Muso Ladamunen, which is the Project for the Empowered Woman. This program is absolutely incredible. I can't emphasize to you enough. This non-governmental organization is a partnership between Americans and Malians. However, the American staff is close to nil, and it is close to 70 strong with host country national staff members. It's an organization that is very much grassroots, coordinated by host country nationals and implemented and really supported by the communities in which they serve. So Project Muso in particular served one suburb of the capital, Yirimajo, which started when the organization began. There were only about 20,000 people. Within 5 years, that had tripled to 60,000 people. Project Muso had a threefold approach to strengthening the health system in that community and to facilitating the empowerment of local people. So first of all, they worked with the community-based malaria program, with which I worked, and these are photos of our community-based malaria program community health workers, so women who are particularly charged with going out into the community, serving as liaisons between that official health clinic and the community, reaching those hard-to-target folks. And their goal in particular was to do rapid malaria diagnostic testing and treatment in the home for children under 5, with the end goal of reducing childhood mortality. In partnership with the community-based malaria program, this non-governmental organization also provided classes that were oriented towards literacy for adults, but included a curriculum of human rights discussion. And in addition, there was a microfinance or an entrepreneurial endeavor sector. So it was this threefold, sort of this trifecta, acknowledging that people can't pursue their health needs if they can't have their basic economic needs met. People can't be fully engaged until they understand the issues that are ahead of them. And so many of these individuals who worked in these three sectors, there was overlap, of course. There were women who were community health workers who were also a part of lending institutions, or women who ran these different educational classrooms and also provided support to microfinance. So what I'd like to note is that the rate of under 5 childhood mortality was about 155 per 1,000 at the baseline of this program. They actually conducted a randomized household cross-sectional survey in the area, and there was a 10-fold difference in childhood mortality by the time this program had been implemented for 5 years. So in 5 years' time, they were able to literally make a 10-fold difference in childhood mortality, which per our understanding is completely unprecedented. This organization worked from a completely grassroots perspective to help enable leaders to develop, to mobilize other individuals in their community, and to aggressively pursue their needs. And so this piece of literacy and those classes, I'd like to highlight that that was in coordination with the non-governmental organization Tostan. Tostan, which is actually based in Senegal, they are well known and mentioned in the book Half the Sky. They actually are making groundbreaking reduction in female genital mutilation rates by using this classroom perspective. So, and the idea is by discussing human rights, they never introduce the topic themselves or the facilitators outside powers. They just introduce this context of human rights. As the facilitators move through this discussion, it has naturally come up and been identified as a need time and time again. The communities in which these classrooms work have said, even if we're not going to do this, if the communities that we marry our wives to aren't going to do this, then it's not worth it. So they've taken action to educate and inspire and insist that the communities around them no longer practice female genital mutilation, and they're seeing groundbreaking reduction. So I'm very proud to have been a part of that organization, and I would definitely encourage you to find out more. It's Project Muso, muso.org. So thank you so much for the opportunity today to share my greatest passion.